The clink of ice against glass usually sounded like music. Tonight, it sounded like a countdown. Sophie kept her eyes on the lemon wedge she was slicing, but she could feel the heat of Andrew Tate's gaze. Heavy, wet, and demanding. The lounge was a graveyard of half-empty bottles and shadows, the upscale silence only making his voice more abrasive. When his hand finally shot out, it wasn't a fumble, it was a strike. His fingers clamped around her wrist, his grip bruisingly tight against the bone. The air in the room didn't just turn cold, it vanished. Sophie's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. Don't react, her mind whispered, a mantra from a life she'd tried to bury. Stay small. Stay invisible. But as Andrew pulled her closer, the stench of bourbon and malice filling her senses, a shadow fell across the bar. It was a weightier, darker presence that seemed to swallow the dim light of the lounge. The shouting died in Andrew's throat, replaced by a pathetic, rattling breath. Behind him stood a man who didn't need to move to dominate. Kong Hyun-tae, in a suit as black as an oil slick, his neck tattoos spiraling like dark warnings under the neon. His eyes weren't looking at the drunk. They were fixed on Sophie, reflecting a dangerous recognition that threatened to shatter her carefully constructed world. The air in the lounge didn't just grow still, it curdled. Andrew's grip on my wrist, which a second ago had felt like an iron shackle, suddenly began to tremble. I didn't need to look at the man behind him to know the temperature of the room had dropped to sub-zero. I only looked at Andrew's eyes, the way his pupils dilated, the way the alcohol-fueled bravado drained out of his face, leaving behind a sickly, sallow mask of terror. You're touching something that doesn't belong to you. A voice vibrated through the room. It wasn't loud. It was a low, melodic baritone that carried the weight of a funeral bell. Andrew tried to speak, his mouth working like a fish out of water. I was just. He never finished. Kong Hyun-tae didn't lay a finger on him. Not yet. He simply stepped closer, his shadow swallowing Andrew whole. The presence Hyun-tae radiated was absolute. A gravity so heavy it forced the air out of the lungs of everyone in the room. He leaned in, his face inches from Andrew's ear, his slicked back hair gleaming under the amber pendant lights. The heavy ink of the tattoos on his neck seemed to writhe like living shadows against his skin. Down, Hyun-tae commanded. The word was a physical blow. Andrew's knees hit the hardwood floor with a sickening thud. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. He looked like a man who had accidentally stepped into a cage with a tiger and was only now realizing the door had been locked from the outside. His hands, finally releasing my bruised wrist, went up in a pathetic, shaky gesture of surrender. I stepped back, rubbing the red welts forming on my skin, but my eyes weren't on my attacker. They were fixed on Hyun-tae. He finally turned his gaze toward me. For 3 years, I had lived in the gray spaces of the city, hiding behind a name that wasn't mine and a life that felt like a borrowed coat. I had convinced myself that I was Sophie Mitchell, a woman who survived on tips and stayed invisible. But as Hyun-tae's cold, obsidian eyes locked onto mine, the lie shattered. He didn't look at me like a stranger. He looked at me with the devastating intimacy of a man who had memorized every line of my soul. In that silent, suffocating exchange, the quiet life I had bled for evaporated. The apron, the glassware, the graveyard shifts, it was all gone. The iron orchid hadn't been buried. She had just been waiting for the frost to break. Hyun-tae's stare promised a reckoning, not just for the coward trembling on the floor, but for the 3 years of silence between us. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. The ghost of my past had finally walked through the front door, and he was never going to let me go again. The lounge emptied with the frantic efficiency of a sinking ship. Andrew had scrambled out on all fours the moment Hyun-tae's shadow shifted, and the few lingering patrons followed, their eyes fixed on the floor to avoid witnessing a scene that might cost them their lives. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, and suddenly, the only sounds were the hum of the refrigerator and the frantic thrum of blood in my ears. Hyun-tae didn't move. He stood with his back to the bar, his hands casually shoved into his pockets, yet the air around him felt charged with enough electricity to ignite the room. He looked at the rows of bottles behind me, his reflection caught in the mirrors, sharp, lethal, and devastatingly familiar. "You've gotten better at the act, Sophie," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The slouch. The tired eyes. "You almost look like someone who doesn't know how to kill a man with a cocktail stirrer." I gripped the edge of the mahogany bar, my knuckles white. I wasn't acting. I was living. I was done with that world, Hyuntae. I was done with you. He finally turned, and the sheer intensity of his gaze forced me to hold my breath. He stepped into my space, bridging the gap until I could smell the expensive tobacco and cold rain clinging to his wool coat. He reached out, not to touch me, but to slide a thin, manila envelope across the damp bar top. "You think you've been hiding," he murmured, a dark smirk playing on his lips. "You think you found this hole in the wall by accident? I've watched you walk to work every night for 3 years. I know which floorboards in your apartment creak. I know you still check the seals on your windows every time you walk into a room." The revelation hit me harder than Andrew's grip ever could. I had lived in a cocoon of false safety, believing I was the one in control. "If you knew where I was, why show up now? To reclaim your property?" His expression shifted, the predatory amusement vanishing to reveal a grim, jagged edge. He leaned down, his forehead nearly touching mine, his voice dropping to a ghost of a whisper. "I didn't come here to bring you home, Sophie. And I didn't come here to save you from a drunk." He tapped the envelope. "The agency found the ledger you took. They didn't send Tate here to harass a waitress. They sent him to confirm a target. I'm not here to claim you. I'm here because by sunrise, this city becomes a hunting ground, and you are the only prize that matters." The backroom truth was a cold splash of reality. The sanctuary I had built was a paper fortress, and the man I had run from was the only thing standing between me and the fire. I stared at the envelope on the bar, the damp paper curling under the weight of Hyuntae's revelation. My hands trembled as I reached for it, the friction of the paper against my skin feeling like a spark to a fuse. Inside was a single, grainy photograph taken from a long-range lens. It was me, 3 days ago, taking out the trash behind the lounge. But it wasn't the photo that froze my blood, it was the digital watermark in the corner. A stylized, geometric eye. The agency. Tate didn't look like a Fed, I whispered, my voice sounding thin even to my own ears. I thought of Andrew's clumsy hands, his slurred threats, the sheer amateurism of his harassment. He was a mess. A drunk. He was too loud, too visible. "That's exactly why they used him," Hyuntae said, his voice a low growl as he paced the small space behind the bar, his presence making the high-end lounge feel like a cage. "Andrew Tate wasn't an agent, Sophie. He was a pointer, a disgraced local cop with a gambling debt and a grudge against the woman who cost him his badge during your last operation. They didn't need a professional to catch you. They needed a loudmouth distraction to see if you'd break cover." He stopped pacing and leaned over the bar, his neck tattoos dark and menacing under the flickering neon sign. "And you did. The moment you looked at him with that iron orchid coldness in your eyes, the moment your hand moved toward his carotid artery, the sensor in his watch sent your biometrics straight to their server. The seal is broken, Sophie. The agency doesn't just know you're alive. They know exactly which street corner you're standing on." I looked back at the door, half expecting the glass to shatter at any moment. The quiet life I had meticulously crafted, the graveyard shifts, the small tips, the anonymity of the city, had been nothing more than a glass house. Andrew wasn't just a pervert. He was the tip of a spear that had been aimed at my heart for 3 years. "They won't just come for me," I said, finally meeting Hyuntae's gaze. "If they know I'm here, they know you're here. They'll use me to get to the syndicate." Hyuntae reached across the bar, his thumb grazing the bruise on my wrist with a tenderness that contradicted the lethality in his eyes. "Let them come," he murmured. "They think they're hunting a waitress. They've forgotten that even a ghost can bleed you dry." The fear that had been a cold lump in my stomach began to harden, turning into something sharper, something familiar. The agency had sent a pointer to find a girl. Instead, they had successfully woken the one person who knew exactly where all their bodies were buried. The drive to the outskirts of the city was a blur of neon streaks and tense, heavy silence. Hyuntae drove with a predatory focus, his large hands relaxed yet ready on the leather steering wheel, while I watched the rearview mirror, waiting for the headlights of a spear-tip agency team to pierce the darkness. We didn't speak until the wrought iron gates of his private estate hissed shut behind us, sealing out the world and the ghosts that hunted me. The estate was a fortress of glass, steel, and shadows, perched on a cliffside that overlooked the churning black veins of the Han River. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and the faint, metallic tang of gun oil, a scent that shouldn't have felt like home, but did. The perimeter is thermal mapped, Hyuntae said, shedding his suit jacket to reveal the holstered weapon strapped to his side and the full, intricate canvas of ink spanning his shoulders. If so much as a stray cat breathes near the fence, my men will know. But tonight, the house is empty. Just us. He led me into a wide, dimly lit tactical suite. Screens flickered against the walls, scrolling through grayscale security feeds of the surrounding forest. The tension between us, which had been a taut wire in the lounge, now began to pull tight. I stood by the central map table, feeling the weight of the last 3 years crashing down. I wasn't just Sophie the waitress anymore. I was a woman standing in the heart of a storm with the only man who truly saw me. Hyuntae moved behind me, his presence a sudden, radiant heat against my back. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the electricity arcing between us. When I turned, he was right there, imposing, beautiful, and dangerous. "You're shaking," he whispered. "I'm out of practice." I lied, my voice breathy. His hand came up then, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw before sliding into my hair. The touch was a spark to a powder keg. Every memory of the nights we'd spent together before the betrayal, the sweat, the whispered secrets, the shared blood, surfaced in a violent rush. I reached up, my fingers digging into the hard muscle of his forearms, pulling him closer. The kiss wasn't a greeting, it was a collision. It tasted of desperation and long-suppressed hunger. For a moment, the agency, the pointers, and the impending siege vanished. There was only the scrape of his stubble against my skin and the low, guttural sound he made as he lifted me onto the table. We were preparing for a war, but as we moved together in the flickering light of the monitors, I realized the most dangerous thing in this house wasn't the weapons on the walls. It was the fact that I would burn the entire world down before I let them take me away from him again. The heat of the tactical suite still clung to my skin as Hyuntae led me deeper into the belly of the estate. We descended a spiral staircase of cold industrial steel, the air growing thinner and more sterile with every step. At the base sat a heavy vault door, biometric and reinforced, looking like it belonged in a central bank rather than a private residence. "I told you I've been watching over you," Hyuntae said, his voice echoing in the confined space. He pressed his palm to the scanner. With a hydraulic hiss, the massive door swung inward. I expected to see rows of gold or stacks of currency. Instead, the room was a curated museum of a life I had tried to burn. My breath hitched. On the back wall, behind a glass casing, hung a black tactical suit, the high-grade Kevlar weave I had worn during the infiltration of the Choi Syndicate. Below it sat a row of personalized combat knives, their handles worn from the grip of my own palms. "You kept it," I whispered, stepping toward a central pedestal. There, preserved in a velvet-lined box, lay my old agency ID and a passport in a name I hadn't used in years, the Iron Orchid. "I didn't just keep the gear, Sophie," Hyuntae said, standing close enough for me to feel the vibration of his voice. "I kept the identity you thought you had to kill. You thought that by becoming a waitress, you were protecting me. But I never wanted a ghost. I wanted the woman who was brave enough to hunt me." I ran a finger over the cold steel of my favorite sidearm, a custom-fitted piece that felt like a natural extension of my arm the moment I lifted it. The weight was grounding, a physical anchor back to the reality of who I truly was. Every memory attached to these objects came rushing back, not as trauma, but as a weaponized map of my own capabilities. I wasn't just a girl who had been found. I was an operative who had been rearmed. Looking at the gear, I realized Hyuntae hadn't just been tracking my movements. He had been maintaining my arsenal, waiting for the inevitable day the agency's seal would break. He hadn't seen me as a victim in need of a hiding place, but as a partner in need of her tools. I stripped off the white waitress shirt, letting it fall to the floor like a discarded skin. As I began to pull on the tactical gear, the Sophie who lived on tips and apologies vanished entirely. The fit was perfect. Hyuntae had seen to that. As I clicked the holster into place, I looked at him through the mirror. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. The agency had sent a pointer to find a waitress. They were about to find out that the iron orchid had never actually stopped blooming. The silence of the estate was no longer peaceful. It was a coiled spring. I stood in the center of the tactical suite, the Kevlar of my suit a familiar, heavy second skin. Hyuntae was at the far console, his broad back to me as he toggled through the thermal perimeter feeds. "The wind is picking up," he remarked, his voice steady. "The sensors are picking up ghost signals in the tree-line. Probably just the pines swaying. But I felt it before the screen showed it. A prickle at the base of my skull, a sudden, sharp displacement of air that had nothing to do with the wind. I didn't think, I moved. The Sophie who poured drinks would have frozen, but the iron orchid thrived in the fraction of a second before chaos. "Down!" I barked. I lunged across the space, my shoulder hitting Hyuntae's hip with the force of a battering ram, sending us both sprawling behind the reinforced titanium map table. A split second later, the floor-to-ceiling glass of the panoramic window didn't just shatter, it disintegrated. A high-velocity suppressed round hissed through the space where Hyuntae's head had been a heartbeat before, punching a hole through the monitors behind him with a spray of sparks and melting plastic. "North-northwest," I shouted over the sudden roar of the wind rushing into the room. Hyuntae was already moving, his face a mask of cold, disciplined rage. He reached for his sidearm, but I was faster. I drew the custom-fitted handgun he had kept for me, leaned around the edge of the table, and fired 3 rounds into the darkness of the tree-line. The muzzle flashes illuminated the rain for a strobe light second. A muffled cry echoed from the woods, followed by the heavy thud of a body falling through branches. "One down," I muttered, my breathing rhythmic and shallow. But that was a spotter's shot. The breach team is already on the terrace. The agency had sent professionals, but they had made a fatal error. They thought they were raiding a Mafia boss's home to kill a witness. They didn't realize they had walked into a crossfire between a king and the finest assassin they had ever trained. Hyuntae looked at me, his eyes burning with a mix of pride and lethal intent. He reached out, his hand squeezing my shoulder, the grip bruising and grounding. "I missed that look in your eyes," he whispered as the secondary alarms began to wail, a rhythmic red pulse that bathed the room in the color of blood. I didn't smile. I checked my magazine. "Don't get sentimental, Hyuntae. We have 6 more heat signatures crossing the perimeter. Let's show them why the orchid is back." The smoke from the short-circuited monitors curled toward the ceiling, mingling with the mist blowing in through the jagged remains of the window. On the floor, the 2 agency operatives I'd neutralized lay still, but the adrenaline in my veins was far from cooling. Hyuntae stood over one of the bodies, his face carved from granite. He wasn't looking at the dead man's face. He was looking at his gear. "They didn't breach the perimeter," Hyuntae said, his voice dangerously quiet. "The thermal sensors didn't trigger because they were already inside the secondary fence when the first shot was fired." I knelt beside the other operative, my gloved fingers searching the tactical vest. I pulled out a small, encrypted handheld device. It was still active, a blinking blue light indicating a live connection to a local signal. My eyes narrowed as I scrolled through the last received transmission. It wasn't a set of orders. It was a set of real-time bypass codes for the estate's security grid, codes that were rotated every 6 hours. "Hyuntae," I said, my voice tight. "These codes were issued 40 minutes ago. Only 3 people in your organization have access to the rotation schedule." The weight of the silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire had been. The realization that the agency hadn't just found me, but had been invited in, turned my blood to ice. This wasn't just an external hunt. It was a coordinated execution. Hyuntae walked over to the central map table, his eyes tracking the signal source of the handheld. The signal didn't come from a remote server, he murmured, tapping the glass. A red dot began to pulse on the screen, localized within a 5-mile radius of the estate, specifically at a private dock used exclusively by his senior lieutenants. It's Park. The name felt like a physical blow. Park had been Hyuntae's right hand since they were boys. He was the one who had helped me disappear 3 years ago, the one who had sworn to keep our secrets. The Judas contract, I whispered, the name of the agency's infamous deep-cover bribery protocol surfacing in my mind. They didn't just find me, Hyuntae. They bought the only person you trusted to keep me hidden. Hyuntae's hand tightened on the edge of the table until the reinforced glass groaned. The tattoos on his neck seemed to darken as the fury took hold. He didn't explode in rage. He became something much worse, something cold and absolute. He sold the coordinates to the agency to settle his own debts, Hyuntae said, finally looking at me. The recognition in his eyes was no longer just romantic. It was a shared vow of vengeance. He thinks he's watching the agency finish us off from the safety of the docks. I checked the slide on my handgun, the metallic clack echoing in the ruined room. The waitress who feared the shadows was gone. The iron orchid was in full bloom, and she had a list of names to cross off. Then let's not keep him waiting. If there's a contract on our lives, it's time we personally terminate it. The black silk of my gown felt like a shroud, but beneath the shimmering fabric, the cold weight of a ceramic blade was strapped to my thigh. The Grand Seoul Hotel was a cathedral of glass and gold, humming with the forced laughter of the city's elite. We didn't sneak in. Hyuntae walked through the front doors like a god returning to a world that had forgotten him. His hand was firm on the small of my back, his presence a silent declaration of war that kept the security detail frozen in a state of confused deference. There, Hyuntae murmured, his voice barely a vibration against my ear. On the mezzanine, overlooking a sea of champagne and diamonds, stood the two halves of our shared nightmare. Park was there, looking every bit the loyal lieutenant in his tailored tuxedo, though the way his eyes darted toward the exits betrayed the rot in his soul. Beside him was Director Vance, the head of the agency's Ghost Protocol, the man who had signed my death warrant 3 years ago. They were a study in treachery, leaning close to finalize the sale of my life. As we ascended the grand staircase, the music seemed to fade into a dull roar. The waitress was gone. Every step I took was measured, lethal, and precise. When we reached the mezzanine, Park's glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the marble floor. The sound was like a starting pistol. Hyuntae, Park stammered, his face turning the color of ash. I thought the estate was gone. Hyuntae finished for him, his voice a low, terrifying silk. He stepped into the light, the tattoos on his neck visible even above the high collar of his shirt. You forgot who taught you how to hunt, Park. You never strike at a wolf unless you're sure he's already dead. Director Vance didn't flinch. He reached for the suppressed pistol tucked into his waistband, but my hand was already moving. In one fluid motion, I closed the distance, the ceramic blade appearing in my hand as if summoned from the air. I pressed the edge against his jugular before his thumb could even flick the safety. The iron orchid sends her regards, Director. I whispered, my gaze locking onto his. The fear in his eyes was the sweetest thing I had tasted in 3 years. Around us, the gala continued, the guests oblivious to the fact that the two most powerful men in the room were seconds away from becoming ghosts. You can't kill us here, Vance hissed, his breath hitching against the blade. The fallout would destroy you both. Hyuntae leaned in, his shadow eclipsing them both. We aren't here to kill you in public, Director. We're here to show you that the ledger Sophie took wasn't just evidence. It was a list of every offshore account you used to pay Park. By tomorrow morning, the agency won't be looking for her. They'll be looking for you. The look of total realization on their faces was the final seal on my past. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the architect of their ruin. 6 months later, the rain returned to Seoul, but it no longer felt like needles of fear. It felt like a cleansing. The neon signs of the city blurred against the windows of the lounge, which had been rebuilt into a fortress of velvet, shadow, and reinforced glass. I sat at the center of the bar, not behind it as a servant, but atop a leather stool as its owner. The white waitress shirt was a ghost of a past life. Tonight, I wore a silk blouse the color of bruised plums, the weight of a gold-plated signet ring heavy on my finger, the seal of the syndicate. The lounge was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of a cello playing over the speakers. Hyuntae emerged from the back office, his presence still a gravitational force that pulled the air from the room. He didn't say a word as he reached me. He simply placed a hand on my shoulder, his thumb tracing the line of my neck where the iron orchid tattoo now sat uncovered, bold and defiant. We were no longer hiding in the gray spaces. We were the shadows that the monsters feared. The heavy oak doors creaked open, admitting a gust of cold, wet air. A young woman stumbled in, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes darting around with the frantic, wide-eyed look of a cornered animal. She looked exactly as I had 6 months ago, bruised, hunted, and breathless. She saw the tattoos on Hyuntae's neck, the cold authority in his gaze, and she began to turn back toward the rain. "Stop," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the absolute weight of a queen. The woman froze. I slid a glass of amber liquid across the polished mahogany toward the empty stool beside me. "The doors are locked now," I told her, my voice softening but remaining firm. "The man following you won't make it past the sidewalk. In this room, his power doesn't exist. Only mine does." She looked at me, searching my face for the lie, but she found only the ironclad truth of a woman who had walked through the fire and brought the flames back with her. Slowly, she sat. As she took her first steady breath in what looked like years, I looked up at Hyuntae. He gave me a sharp, proud nod. The old order had been built on the backs of the vulnerable, but the new order was different. We were the sanctuary and the blade. I reached out and covered the woman's shaking hand with my own, the signet ring catching the light. "Drink," I whispered. "Then tell me his name. We're going to make sure he never steers anyone into the dark again."